Now, in this video, I'm going to try and answer a few questions, mainly just who and or what is the Bendu, and what can he maybe teach us about the Force. And I'm going to freely admit right here at the start that there's going to be a lot of supposition and guesswork as I try to tie the few pieces of information we have about him together to form a bigger picture. And after the video, by all means, leave your own theories about the Bendu in the comments below. Anyway, let's start with what's probably the most interesting aspect of the Bendu, that being he seems to be the first example in the new canon at least of something akin to a truly balanced or gray Force user, though something tells me he himself wouldn't be a fan of either such description. And that's because the first time we encounter the Bendu, which is when Kanan meets him in the first episode of Season 3 of Rebels, he seems to scoff at the idea of being called a Force wielder by Kanan, almost as if the Bendu feels or believes Kanan is completely missing something or failing to understand a greater truth about the Force. The Bendu then goes on to simply describe himself as the one in the middle, and doesn't claim to be any type of Force wielder really, though he clearly is one on some level. He also says at one point that the Jedi and Sith wield the Ashla and the Bogan, or the light and the dark sides of the Force. And by the way he says all this, it's almost as if he's implying these two aspects, the light and the dark, are somehow not a part of the Force itself, but rather something separate from the real Force, if you will. And I know such a belief seems to fly in the face of everything some of us hold true about the Force, that being that it's actually made up of both the light and the dark sides, that they are very much real and, dare I say, two almost tangible pieces that make up one singular energy field that those who can use the Force draw upon. After all, in The Last Jedi, Luke even says that the Force is made up of powerful light and powerful dark, which has given credence to this belief by some that the right answer for the Jedi, or any who seek a balance in the Force, is to learn to use both the light and the dark side. However, I think the Bendu would not only disagree with that assessment of the Force entirely, but that he would say using the Force at all, light, dark, or both, in an effort to balance it would be an exercise in futility, that if you want the Force to be balanced, it should be completely left alone. He'd likely say that even the Jedi, who use the light side in an effort to try and get to and maintain balance, will eventually cause imbalance, as seems to be the case with the Jedi of the prequel era. And this is because the Bendu likely doesn't believe the light and dark sides even exist within the Force, and he sees himself as the one in the middle of two misguided beliefs, those of the Jedi and Sith. And in order to perhaps understand this line of thinking on his part, let's go back to before there was even life in the Star Wars galaxy, back to a time when there was just the Force. And yes, this is where we're going to get really speculative for a moment. Because I would assume that the Force does indeed predate life, that they didn't come about at the exact same moment, that for an indefinite length of time there was just the Force. In fact, in Season 6 of the Clone Wars animated series, we learned that the midi-chlorians were the very first life forms in the galaxy, and that they allowed all other forms of life to come into existence. And I'd have to imagine it took eons until sentient life came into being, and even longer before that sentient life discovered or gained knowledge of the Force, and longer still before someone learned how to use the Force. And if this very brief history of the Star Wars galaxy is indeed accurate, the interesting question then becomes, were the light and the dark side always there, since before even life existed, or did they come about at some point after, and if so, when? In other words, did the light and dark sides of the Force come about with the first life forms, or were they something created or given shape much later, perhaps by the first conscious minds who tried to make sense of why what they deemed to be evil had to exist? Is it even possible that the first person with not only knowledge of the Force, but influence over it, created the dark side, or the Bogan, the first time they drew on it for selfish reasons? Now, whether or not he's right or wrong can be debated, but I believe this is the Bendu's belief, that if the Force was simply left alone, that if no one ever wielded it, there would be no dark and light sides, there would only be the Force and a balance, and that these two sides are merely aberrations of the Force, given shape by the conscious minds of those who use it, though I think over time they have become real, if you will. For example, the Mortis story arc in Season 3 of the Clone Wars seems to be evidence to this fact, that the light and the dark, or the Ashla and the Bogan, have become something akin to constructs within the Force, or even conscious entities, and are represented by the daughter and son, who the father constantly tries to keep in check. And before I delve further into all that, I'll just let you know one of my next videos will tackle the topic of Mortis in great detail. Furthermore, in the recent Aftermath book series, we've learned that those who use the dark side seem to leave a stain upon the Force, or at least leave some type of residual effect upon the items they once owned, such as masks. This seems to further be evidence that those who use the dark side leave a lasting effect on the Force, and may even generate the dark side, and is further evidence that the light and dark sides were created at some point. Also in this series, we learn that somewhere out in the unknown regions of space, there seems to be a massive dark side presence, and one that Darth Sidious heard calling out to him. My best guess says that whatever this presence is, it is the culmination of the damage that those who wield the dark side have left upon the Force, and may even be responsible for the creature Snoke. Okay, so if the Bendu believes that the Force should essentially be left alone, how is he then so powerful with it? How, as he himself basically says, has he been around for so long and will be around for much longer still? He even more or less tells Thrawn at one point that he can't kill him, that he's beyond death. Does that mean that the Bendu is a part of the Force too? That perhaps, much like how the Ashla and the Bogan represent the dark and the light, he is a manifestation that represents the Force itself. After all, he does refer to himself as the Bendu, which implies that it is not a personal name, but rather more along the lines of a thing that he considers himself, or that he is a singular something. Well, I think there is some evidence to suggest that whoever or whatever he truly is, he hasn't always been the Bendu, but became it at some point. First, we have what Thrawn says in the episode of Rebels called 0 Hour, and that is, in reference to the sector of space that the Bendu's planet is in, which is called Atollon, that there was an ancient race of beings that lived there that apparently wanted to remain hidden. Bendu even tells Kanan at one point during this same episode that, "Do you think it was chance that this planet was so difficult to find?" And I believe the Bendu was, or still is I suppose, a member of that race of now otherwise extinct people, considering he also refers to Atollon at one point as his peaceful world. I also think it's possible that the rest of the Bendu's people were wiped out at one point during a war or conflict between the Jedi and the Sith that likely found its way to their world, and probably because of a connection to the Force the planet had, or a battle over something that at one point may have been kept secret and hidden there by this ancient race, which might be the root cause for Bendu's current beliefs about the Force, or something that only reiterated beliefs that were already in place by either him or his people on the whole. That being that using the Force for any reason, good or evil, would cause imbalance. And then the reason why his people may have been wiped out in this conflict is because they refused to take any action at all, which might begin to explain why the Bendu became so angry when Kanan, again during this episode of Rebels called 0 Hour, implores the Bendu to take a side and to help them fight the Imperials. And then, after the Bendu again says he does not take sides and he is the one in the middle, Kanan calls him a coward, which is the last straw for the Bendu, who then takes action by turning into a giant force storm and destroying both sides indiscriminately. Which, on the surface, seems a little odd and out of character, that it wasn't all that difficult to provoke this ancient creature into action when he seems rather set in his ways. But who knows, maybe his own people called him a coward once upon a time for not fighting the Jedi and Sith, and that they were ultimately destroyed because of his inaction. Maybe he always has been extremely powerful with the Force, but realized using that power for any reason will cause imbalance, so he sat back and watched his world be destroyed while his people called him a coward. Or perhaps what led to the destruction of the Jedi, Sith, and his own people oh so long ago was him truly embracing that power for the first time, which led him to his current beliefs and is the moment he essentially became the Bendu, the one in the middle who would never again use the Force to take sides, until of course he again did. One way or the other though, I think it's pretty clear the Bendu only sees the Force. The real questions of course are how he came to these beliefs and if they're right or not. Do the light and the dark sides actually exist, or are they only something that exists in the eyes of the beholder, or something that has been created by the intent of sentient beings using the Force? All I know for certain is the Bendu seems to have this belief that it's all on the user. In fact, when Kanan first shows him the Sith holocron, and Kanan warns him to be careful with it because it's dangerous, the Bendu seems to all but laugh at this idea and tells him, "An object cannot make you good or evil. The temptation for power, forbidden knowledge, even the desire to do good can lead some down that path. But only you can change yourself." And of all the things the Bendu has said, this one above all else seems to imply he does not believe there is a light and a dark side, that it influences people or shapes their destiny, that all comes from within and your own choices. Only you can change yourself, he says, which means only you can choose to be good or evil, light or dark, that outside forces do not steer you in one direction or the other. In closing, I think calling the Bendu a gray or balanced force user would be a mistake. One way or the other, the Bendu does not use both the dark and the light, but rather, at least from his point of view, he uses neither, for to him, they do not exist. Instead, there is only the force. And yeah, I know that sounds like the very definition of a gray force user, but the word gray implies a mixture of light and dark, and that in itself is a misnomer, because there is no light and dark to create a gray. Yes, he calls himself the one in the middle, but I do not believe he means in reference to being between the dark and the light, but rather between the two beliefs held by the Sith and the Jedi about the Force. Well, that's all I've got for you this time. Now it's your turn to tell me what you think about this video, and to share your own theories about just who and what the Bendu is. So leave a comment below, and let's talk some Star Wars. And until next time, thanks for watching.